Hello, my name's Max Kelly, and I'm going to be presenting this paper today on the link between organisational listening and the localisation agenda at the World Humanitarian Summit on behalf of myself and my colleagues Maree Pardy and Mary Ana McGlasson. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we are meeting in this virtual conference and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. I think we're all aware of the many critiques of the humanitarian system, that it ignores or disempowers local and national humanitarian actors and responders to claims of systemic and institutionalised racism and colonialism. However, this research starts from the premise that something positive happened at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. One of the outcomes was that localisation has emerged as a really strong discourse. It's not particularly agreed on, and we know that a lot of the post-summit commitments have not in any way significantly disrupted the system. However, it is still a core discourse. So the aim of this research is actually to discover what allowed the discourse to change. How did a localisation agenda emerge that could, in essence, fundamentally have shifted the power dynamics in the international humanitarian system? It emerged through the noise of a global summit. And our premise is that an organisational listening frame of reference can give us some insights into those questions. Organisational listening is a concept put forward by Thomas McNamara in some work in 2015 and 2020. And his argument is that voice and speaking up is recognised as fundamental for democracy, for representation and for social equity. However, he identifies a crisis of listening, the major issue not always being denied a voice, but being denied an audience who listens, particularly for marginalised communities. And he terms this ethical listening. McNamara's architecture of listening consists of 8 key elements. So the culture, policies, politics, structures and processes, technologies, resources, skills, and the articulation of listening to decision-making and policy-making. For the purposes of today's presentation, really only focusing on the culture, politics, structures and processes, and the articulation of listening to decision-making. The research is interpretive in design, utilising a qualitative methodology. So in-depth, semi-structured expert interviews, of which we conducted a total of 19 over December and January 2020 and 2021. The research focuses on 2 key periods. After the announcement of the summit in 2012 and the formation of the Secretariat in 2013, we're focusing on the consultation period, regional and global consultations from 2014 and 15. And then the second phase of results looks at the 6 months leading up to the summit and the summit itself in May 2016. There was a fairly universal agreement that the space created through the summit process, in essence the consultations, was both intentional and organic. So there was a strong relaying of intentions for the search for innovative solutions and ideas, from Ban Ki-moon down through UN-OCHA, down through to the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat and onto the consultations. In essence, it provided a space for individual convictions and the ideals of key stakeholders in the process to design and implement a process that forced a space that wasn't naturally there. So in essence, they were given a remit to look for those who weren't currently in charge to have more influence. So the intention from the Summit Secretariat was to shift the power dynamics quite significantly and really start from the bottom. And the argument is for such a summit, which would normally be an intergovernmental process, to start at the bottom and to be defined by the needs of the people is what one respondent referred to as very, very unique. Very, very, very unique. And this is perhaps the core point. The uniqueness was not just in the breadth of the consultation, but its conception. The United Nations is one of the oldest intergovernmental organisations, and intergovernmental processes and deliberations form the heart of the UN system within which OCHA sits. Intergovernmental processes negotiate outcomes. However, even member states go as far as determining who should be invited. The World Humanitarian Summit did not deliberately follow this path, which allowed for an organic emergence of the debate around localisation and other key issues, which were relevant to far more actors than just the power brokers. Another key theme that emerged was that of inclusion. Who was actually in the room? And in essence, there was a quite broad inclusion, and it was intentional, and it was navigated by defining different categories of people and by organising steering committees for the regional consultations of those who were embedded in the regions. However, beyond the broad-scale representation of people in the room, it's obviously important to acknowledge the power dynamics in any group. And perhaps part of the magic of these events were in managing that power dynamic closely. One respondent noted their previous experience of being talkers and listeners, and that the talkers, even when in the complete minority in numbers, were the expats or the internationals. But the organisation was to say, no, you can't send 2 people from the World Health Organization or the World Food Programme or the big ones. You can't do that. You can't have 5 UN agencies in a regional consultation. You have to organise amongst yourselves and work out who's going to represent the UN. And in a way, the argument is that pushed a lot of organisations to work differently. So what became apparent through this process is that the consultation period itself was actually really innovative in creating both a speaking and a listening space. So we actually unpacked what some of that innovation was. And the first one is in the definition of success. In its conception, one of our respondents noted that they asked what was a definition of success from the powers that be. And they were told that if you can get people into the room with a lot of different stakeholders, get a mixed bag and really challenge them and have bust-ups, those conversations are held would be a huge success, because then actual ideas and solutions start coming out. And this was central, I think. The second innovation point was the fact that it was a multi-stakeholder process. And as I said, this is really unusual in these kind of summit events. And the third one is that the process itself actually engendered an intense amount of optimism and energy for change. As someone noted, I think, however, Jamila managed to pull that one off, or whoever did it, to create that open free space during consultations. And that was the formative thingy. I love that quote, the formative thingy. But the energy and optimism that was created was the basis for a huge amount of hope for possibility for change. And I suppose the final part of the consultation that needs to be addressed is who was not happy, who were the dissenters, both with the process and the outcomes. And there was 3 core groups. The first one was noted as being international NGOs, not faith-based NGOs, which were widely noted as being allies, but international NGOs who either do direct implementation or who are firmly embedded in the system, as being not very excited to hear about these discussions and not very supportive. Different UN agencies, there's a really interesting comment, I think they feel we're secure here where we are. The multilateral system isn't going to change, a bit of a tweak here and there. And the third group that in essence were not really particularly engaged were donors. Usually donors are a bit hard to reach, was one of the comments. So then we moved to the World Humanitarian Summit itself. 6 months out from the summit, there was what is being called the change. There was this dramatic change, both in the location of the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat, to the key personnel, to the head of OCHA, who was replaced. Dr. Jamila Mahmood stepped away as the head of the Secretariat post the Geneva Summit, but prior to the actual summit. So in essence, the main personnel driving the process changed over. And whether this was a cause or an effect of changes to the summit process isn't clear, but it was noted by one respondent as being a breakdown, which generated a lot of trust issues at a senior level. And it was important to look at what the changes were and the potential impact. The primary message appears to be that the consultative period was seen as field-based. But in essence, they needed to then try and navigate very delicate politics to try and make sure those 2 years of energy and momentum landed somewhere. Or how do you translate all of these nice conversations to meaningful change? And a further argument was that the link between input to event and output hadn't ever really been thought through. So the consultative period, which didn't adhere to traditional approaches and structures, was perceived as anywhere from being just completely out of control or to being excellent. But either way, it needed to be brought back into the fold of the United Nations processes, and it needed to progress in a much more UN-focused manner, back to being an intergovernmental process than the multi-stakeholder process it had been so successfully to this point. There were two key publications prior to the summit. The first was the synthesis of the consultation process, which came out in February 2016. The second one was a report from the high-level panel on humanitarian financing, Too Important to Fail. And this is worth noting because this is actually the origin of the Grand Bargain. So moving on to some of the narratives around the World Humanitarian Summit. The first one is that it was really a PR event, a public relations event, that it needed to provide a preemptive mood to avert disruption because it was a threat to the status quo or a potential threat. So in essence, the summit became a watered down space. So there was an argument that in fact needed to shift to consider what the findings might look like in practice from the consultation. But probably most importantly, it was a shift from a practical to a political space. And then there was this sense of, as per probably normal summit processes, the inner circle, those important people that were moved from room to room and then had debates behind closed doors, and then the periphery, the side events, and so on. And the Grand Bargain was discussed as one of the key outcomes of the summit, and embracing the 25% of funding to local actors and a range of other comments around localisation. However, as I've noted, the Grand Bargain itself came out of a completely different process. For 63 signatories, 25 member states, 11 UN agencies, 5 intergovernmental organisations and 22 international NGOs, there's no Southern representation within the Grand Bargain negotiations, but there's also no Southern signatories to it. It's entirely an agreement amongst the existing architecture of the humanitarian system. So the question is, why is this? And then we move to that notion of those who should have been listening. And what comes up is this sense of the humanitarian system power brokers. And again, the key themes that came up here was that there are entrenched and vested interests, which we all know. But a key concept is there is no room for reform in the UN. Suggestions for reform, which were embedded into some of the documentation from the consultations, were actually removed. You have that notion of the nation state as power brokers, and that the nation states weren't happy with the fact they were being treated as one amongst equals. So it's kind of quite a surreptitious thing. They were like, the sense was they'd let the process continue, but they made sure nothing come out of it. And the third was just the overall threat to the vested interests. So regardless of whatever the tone was up front, deep down there was the intense concern and anxiety that if the South is allowed off its leash, how are we going to keep funding ourselves? And the two final themes came out was that actually the process at the World Humanitarian Summit destroyed the consensus building that had happened previously. So not only was there actively not a sense of organisational listening, but there was a destruction of previous efforts to engage. And the final thing was the lack of an outcome. There was no declaration. And again, this was considered to be a clear message from the member states. Even if the declaration was non-controversial, which it was perceived to be, carrying out a multi-stakeholder process like this shouldn't be a precedent. So what can we conclude from this? Well, the architecture of speaking and listening in the consultation phase was deliberate, it was innovative, and it was very, very, very unique. The culture, the policies, the structures, and the processes for listening were clear, and the lessons for future listening events are to be found here. However, the architecture of organisational listening at the decision-making level through the summit made a clear choice not to listen, in fact to ignore and to dismantle some of what had gone before. And I think some of this appears to come back to the very public and the very political nature of a global summit, which is in reality a barrier to any fundamental change. So the implications of this are very much around, I think, the role of civil society and the networks and the discussions and the discourse, but we need to consider much more carefully how this is articulated back into the humanitarian system and where and when the spaces can be created at a higher level for change. And some of this does seem to come down to individual personalities and ideology and potential for change.